Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today and with another presentation. This particular PowerPoint presentation is going to discuss a little bit about the fundamental understanding of a trust. Not necessarily trusting someone in particular, but more in the financial tool used to build and pass on legacies and different assets within a family or loved ones or charitable events, different things like that. But I definitely want to talk about trust as a whole today and some of the benefits and tools you can use them for. What is a trust? Well, a trust is a structure that holds legal title to assets. It's basically like a holding place for assets for families to pass on to future generations. The trust itself stands as a fiduciary relationship between two different parties. That party would be the grantor or the person that created, and the beneficiaries are the person that will receive the benefits, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a couple of slides. Also, the trust manages assets at the discretion of the grantor, which is the owner. Again, this is trust put into place where the grantor or the owner of the trust can control different aspects of the trust that's created. And also, it's a safe and legal means to protecting assets for the future. Trust is probably one of your best ways to pass on assets to the future because there are so many tools that you can take advantage of that assist in estate taxes and saving a lot of money in the long run. Some of the affiliated parties of a trust. Well, when I say that, we're basically just talking about the people that are associated with the trust or people that come together to create the trust. First and foremost, there's the beneficiaries. The beneficiary holds the right to title assets in the trust. Basically, in anything or any assets that are inside of the trust or passed on or passed towards the beneficiary. You also have a grantor, which is the creator of the trust fund. The grantor also goes by names such as the settlor, the truster, and also the creator. The grantor is normally the person that's pretty much that owns the trust or that has the legal basis to the trust. And last, you have the trustee, which is the actual entity that manages and carries direction of the grantor. The trustee, sometimes it could be a person, it could be a committee, or it could just be the entity that controls the benefits of the assets within the trust. And they basically manage them and pass them on to the effective person or the efficient person that the grantor acknowledges. Why utilize a trust? There are many reasons to utilize a trust. I've mentioned some of the most prevalent ones that I've noticed. As you can see, it provides professional management of the assets, and also it avoids squandering or reckless investment or investing. Whenever you do have a large amount of assets that you're passing on or transporting down to a generation, it's very important that you get that into hands of someone that understands how to manage the money or how to continue to grow the assets. The use of a trust actually does help in that situation. There's also a credit protection, which is another huge aspect or a huge asset to having a trust. Creditors of the beneficiary did not have authorization to make claims or withdraw or deduct anything that the beneficiary is responsible for. The beneficiary himself or herself did not create the pool of assets. Therefore, they cannot be held accountable to distribute those to some of their debts. Not only can they not distribute to any of their creditors or distribute to cover any of their debts, but the beneficiary is not allowed to anticipate any funds and allocate them towards anything other than spending for themselves. And that's considered the spendthrift clause. There's also, in the same breath, you cannot create a trust for yourself or a self-created trust. They're also excluded and they will be subject to the creditor's request. Simply because if you do actually build your trust and you put it into your name and you benefit from it, then your creditors are allowed to make claims against that since it was your assets that accumulated. Moving on to the next phase, we have why utilize a trust. Continued split interest in properties. Trusts allow you to divide the interest of properties or assets. Basically, during estate planning and other wealth transfers, you can divide the interest within the property which would also mitigate or minimize some of your taxes or responsibilities as a grantor. Also, you can avoid the probate process, which is a major um, positive thing. Probate can be very expensive and costly over time. They exploit your privacy, many things that would help if you were able to avoid the probate process. You can accomplish this through a living trust. You create a living trust. Once everything's in place and set up, it will avoid the probate process. And the only downside to that it does not avoid estate taxes, which a revocable trust, that is. But whether it's revocable or irrevocable, they both will be able to avoid the probate process. Moving to the next slide, I'll continue going forward and we'll talk about why to utilize a trust. As stated before, I think the major and the most obvious benefit to utilizing a trust is to minimize the estate taxes for the grantor. The grantor can also take advantage of transferring future appreciated property or assets to their heirs. This also helps to avoid paying undue taxes and different fees associated with transferring the property if you do have it inside of a trust. Another aspect, you could minimize the generational transfer taxes for long-term trust. Again, major saver over the long term if you have a trust that's going to last for a while and it's going to be passed on to someone far in the future. Trust will be the best way to hold those assets until it's time to distribute or disburse to the beneficiaries. It also reduces the size of the grantor's gross estate. And being that it is assets are gifted or passed on through a trust, that also minimizes the grantor's gross estate because the amount that they're passing on will not be counted towards their gross estate tax. And last but not least, we have reduced the income tax for donors of income generated from assets. That kind of re-emphasizes or says the same thing that I just recently stated. Just a major tax benefit for the grantor and also for the beneficiary. They will not have to pay taxes on their assets that they accumulate. The different types of trusts. I use the community chest. I'm a very huge Monopoly fan, so I definitely want to take advantage of using that. But there's a variety of different trusts that we can use. There's revocable, just to name a couple: revocable trust versus irrevocable trust. Inter vivos, which we'll talk about in a few slides. There's testamentary, and there's also a standby trust, a pour over trust. There's also a grantor generated trust. There's also funded versus unfunded trust, and then also there's simple versus compound trust. Again, each of them are very different in their own ways. There are a multitude of options that you can use to set up for a trust. And I'll talk a little bit in detail about them as we go forward. Each one kind of identifies or self-identifies with the oppositions. For example, revocable and irrevocable trust, they kind of are, as their names state. A revocable trust, it may be revoked by the grantor throughout the period of life, while an irrevocable trust, on the other hand, cannot be revoked or changed throughout the process of the grantor's life. Once they set the beneficiaries and set all the parties in place, it must stay into effect until the death of the grantor. Inter vivos is basically you can just think of it as a trust that's created during the life of the grantor. Inter vivos, I think there's like a Latin descent, vivos, life, inter during the middle. So it kind of goes together with what the actual actions of the trust is. And then also you have the testamentary trust, which is created after the death of the grantor. Moving forward to more arrangement types, there's also a standby, which is either unfunded or minimally funded. It's like a trust that stands on the side or stands by until the action takes place for the trust to begin. There's also a pour over trust, which is funded at death of the grantor. And similar attributes, the pour over initiating the assets being poured over at death. You also have a grantor's trust, which is, it can be either revocable or irrevocable. Both have their own benefits. Revocable being that obviously they can revoke the jurisdiction or revoke different titles that were assigned throughout the process of life. Irrevocable, again, meaning that they can't revoke anything once they transfer it. It just becomes, and you can't change the beneficiaries, the trustee, and also the grantor. You also have funded versus unfunded. It's pretty self-explanatory. It either receives funds transferred off the property or it does not until the death of the grantor. And then also we have the simple versus complex. Simple is an annual distribution of basis. It annually distributes the basis and pays out, where complex, it accumulates and it distributes to charities also. So there's those different options that you have with that one. The purpose of a trust. The primary purpose, again, would be avoiding the probate process. Revocable trusts do not avoid the probate process, while irrevocable, I'm sorry, I had those confused. Irrevocable does not, and revocable does allow you to make changes. Probate normally costs up to 5 to 6% of the estate. So being able to skip over the probate process is definitely a benefit. And also another purpose is it discourages the will to contest, or people to contest the will, especially for revocable trusts. This type of trust, it makes it more difficult for the heirs at law to contest because everything's kind of set into place. Continue with the purposes of a trust, and it also increases privacy while the actual document or the disposition of the assets are private. The actual will or the trust itself is public. And then we also have estate taxes. There's many benefits to the estate taxes for the grantor, being whether they get exclusions or different attributes not counting towards their gross estate. But all in all, there's many estate tax purposes to establish a trust. And in conclusion, we talked a little bit about each of these, touched specifically on the importance of a trust and how they're used, what are they used for. We also talked about why they're used. We also talked about the different types. Each type has its own, I guess you can say, its own journey or its own, what's the word I'm looking for? They all do different things. There's no one size fit all. So different trusts have different attributes you can use depending on your situation. You can kind of dig more deeper and understand which one will work best for you, and also the purpose of trust altogether. If you have any questions, any concerns, please do not hesitate to give me a call, reach out to me. I have no problem answering questions or meeting with people. This is something I enjoy, and I enjoy being able to spread this knowledge to you. So please, again, do not hesitate if you have any questions. If there's nothing else, have a great day, and God bless.